I sought this office to restore the soul of America.
4 days after the election, Joe Biden was declared the president-elect of the United States.
It's a corrupt system.
But President Trump is refusing to concede and has filed multiple lawsuits instead. With the nation so divided over the outcome of the vote and the future leadership of the U.S. Senate in limbo till January, how do we move forward as a community? And how will the election impact local schools, transportation funding, and the future of police reform?
The general population wants change.
Girmay, Zahilay and Reagan Dunn of the King County Council weigh in.
We continue to see dramatic increases in crime.
Taking stock of the 2020 election, next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. As our nation transitions from President Donald Trump to President-elect Joe Biden, our state, county, and city have some transitioning to do too. From changes in leadership for our state legislature to new county measures on law enforcement and a citywide transportation tax, Election 2020 has had a widespread impact. President-elect Biden has said he's trying to turn down the temperature on partisan politics. But you can expect to see a lot of local issues heating up as our elected leaders try to interpret and implement what voters asked for on their November ballot.
Renewed faith in tomorrow. Bring a better day.
President-elect Joe Biden says he wants to bring our country closer together, even as President Trump looks for ways to challenge the vote that stopped him from gaining a second term.
If you count the legal votes, I easily win.
But Biden's victory was far from the landslide many media outlets had projected. And even with Kamala Harris on the ticket, the first woman and person of color to be elected vice president, polls show Trump gained with many voters of color and earned a larger share of the black vote than he had in 2016. Add in 2 runoff races in Georgia that will determine which party has a majority in the U.S. Senate, and it would seem the lessons learned from the 2020 election are not completely clear. In our state's congressional delegation, Democrat Kim Schreier is poised to win her District 8 race against Republican Jesse Jensen. But GOP incumbents in Washington held onto their seats easily. And nationwide, though Republicans will still be the minority party in the House of Representatives, they could gain as many as 18 seats. In the Washington state governor's race, Republican challenger Lauren Culp lost to incumbent Democrat Jay Inslee, though Culp does not want to bow out.
The warrior mindset is you don't give up.
Inslee will serve as our first third-term governor in more than 40 years.
I am deeply honored by this vote of confidence in our administration.
Voters also helped Democrats maintain their majorities in the state House and Senate, but it wasn't a complete blue wave.
I'm Secretary of State Kim Wyman.
Republican Kim Wyman beat out Democrat Gail Tarleton to hold on to her Secretary of State job, which has been in GOP control in Washington state for more than 50 years. Some loud conservative voices pushed a grassroots effort to undo the state's new mandatory sex education law, but came up short as Referendum 90 passed.
Congratulations to our teachers across the state.
And progressive voters also won the day in the nonpartisan state superintendent of schools race, as incumbent Chris Rakedahl withstood the challenge of conservative Maya Espinoza.
History shows an appointment process leads to better qualified sheriffs.
King County voters had to choose on 2 charter amendments that re-establish the sheriff as an appointed, not elected position, and give the county council more control over the sheriff's office.
Putting public safety at risk is unacceptable and exactly what this charter amendment will lead to.
Despite pushback from police unions here and nationwide, and a major fundraising advantage for the no campaigns, voters said yes to Amendments 5 and 6. County voters also passed a property tax levy for improvements at Harborview Medical Center, and City of Seattle voters approved a sales tax measure for added bus service. It's all on the road ahead in the aftermath of a historic election
we'll grapple with locally and nationally for years to come.
And joining us to discuss the aftermath of election 2020, we have with us Girmay Zahilay. He's the King County Council member from District 2. We also have Reagan Dunn, the King County Council member from District 9. Thank you both for joining me. And Councilmember Zahilay, I want to start with you here. King County and our state overwhelmingly supported President-elect Joe Biden, but this wasn't the landslide a lot of people were thinking it might be. Give us your main takeaways from the 2020 presidential election.
I think people were presented with two options, one being Joe Biden, who for many people might not be everything that they want, but he is a solid candidate, and another candidate who I believe and many people believe is a threat to democracy, somebody who doesn't want all the votes counted, somebody who has yet to concede the presidency when it's clear that
as of the taping of this show, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So to me, 2020 has shown that the general population wants change away from the Trump administration, and he's doing exactly what we expected him to do, which is very, very scary.
Yeah, and Councilmember Dunn, your thoughts on the election here. What do you make of President Trump's continued legal challenge against President-elect Biden? You have some history in this arena in some ways.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You probably saw in the New York Times that even Republican strategist yesterday, Karl Rove, says there's really no realistic way in which Trump can win re-election. I was on the George Bush's Florida recount effort back in 2000. And the difference in that whole race nationwide came down to just 500 votes in the state of Florida. Those votes had been counted completely, and they had gone through an automatic recount. And the legal fight was over whether they should be counted yet again. You're talking about tens of thousands of votes in many, many states. And so the chances of Trump winning are pretty much zero or very near to it. And legal challenges. One of the things you learn as a lawyer dealing with election law is that the courts generally don't like to touch those cases. They're going to let the vote stand as opposed to trying to usurp the will of the voters. So I think it only prolongs the inevitable, which is the fact that Joe Biden will be sworn in as president in late January of next year.
Okay, thank you for that. Councilmember Zahilay, back to you. We all witnessed history here with the election of Vice President Kamala Harris, the first woman, first person of color to hold that title. But on the flip side, I thought it was interesting. We saw President Trump actually make gains compared to 2016 with black voters, other voters of color. What message do you draw from that?
That's a tough question, Brian. I think that there is so much unrest and there's so much false messaging out there. People believe that the people who voted for Donald Trump may believe that he is a better option than the two candidates on the Democratic side. It may be an issue with our two-party system, but I think the fact remains that one set of candidates are going to do positive things for our country, and the other, in my view, is a threat to our democracy. And I hope that our country can come together around the common issues that we all face.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. And I should point out at this point in the conversation, the King County Council is nonpartisan, but Councilmember Dunn, you've actually run on the GOP ticket in the state before for Attorney General back in 2012. And I wanted to look at that picture. The incumbent Republican members of Congress in our state held onto their seats. Even Jesse Jensen, the Republican in U.S. District 8, seriously outspent, but made it a fairly close race with Democrat Kim Schreier. What does that say to you? We have a no vote to a Republican president, but we have these gains for Republicans when it comes to the House.
Yeah, in fact, we saw that all across the nation and in Washington state. And it tells me that the Republican Party is doing something right with respect to the issues, fiscal discipline, making sure that we are, providing an adequate support for economy and jobs, things that the Republicans are traditionally good at. I think what you saw was a vote where people didn't like the leadership style of President Trump. They didn't like the way he treated certain groups. And so what happened was Republicans, by and large, did well. President Trump ran behind the rest of the Republican Party, and that's why he hasn't won in this case.
Yeah. And Reagan, let me just stay with you in looking at this and at the Washington state level with the governor's race. Loren Culp, I think we can all agree, really aligned himself with President Trump with regard to the COVID pandemic, some other issues, and that did raise some grassroots support in our state, but it really wasn't enough in this race. Your thought on the Culp campaign and why it fell short? He has not conceded as of the recording of this show either here, and it's been a very interesting time for the Republican Party in our state. I don't know how you recover from a situation like President Trump.
Yeah, well, trust me, the Republican Party will recover very quickly. Some candidates did very, very well. Jamie Herrera Butler, Kim Wyman, who got 54% statewide. Loren Culp ran with the base, which means he got the base vote, which is the most basic component of our state. About 41% is all he got. Because he didn't really do a good job in expanding his base. One of the things you learn early on in politics, that if you want to win and stay elected, not only do you have to have a base that elected you, you have to expand that base every year. Loren Culp hasn't done that, and Donald Trump didn't do that as well, except for a narrow category. For example, Cuban Americans in South Florida.
Yeah. Girmay, back to you here. We saw Democrats winning across the board at the state level. They also maintained their margins in the state House and Senate here. But it was interesting to me also looking at some of the Democrat versus Democrat races, the more moderate candidates like Frank Schopp, Denny Heck, for example, out there, beat out the candidates who position themselves as more progressive. What do you make of that?
I'm hoping that our electorate changes. I think it's no secret that I'm probably on the left end, the more left end of the political spectrum. Reagan would probably say I'm a socialist or something along those lines.
No.
Okay.
You're my main man, Girmay.
I think we got the left part figured out, but keep going, Girmay, please.
I'm just hoping that we continue to make big structural changes. And although some challengers who are more left than their moderate counterparts lost, we also saw things like the charter amendments pass. And so I'm hopeful that every year we're going to start shedding light on the fact that we need big structural reforms, and the candidates who support them will win moving forward.
Got it. Well, let's jump right into those charter amendments, shall we? And I'll start with Charter Amendment 5, which will make the King County Sheriff's Office an appointed rather than elected position again. The last time we had an appointed sheriff was 1996. Girmay, you were one of the 4 sponsors for this measure. What effect do you think having an appointed sheriff is going to have on our region?
I think it'll mean more accountability. If we have an elected sheriff, an independently elected sheriff, that person is just that, more independent. And what 2020 has been showing us is that we don't need more independence for police forces. There are already so many structural barriers to holding police accountable. And so an appointed sheriff who can be hired and fired and who can go through a community stakeholder process, I believe that is more accountability and allows the executive and the council to provide more policy instruction.
Okay. Reagan, I know you opposed this measure, but it made the ballot. People said yes. What impact do you think having an appointed sheriff is going to have on our region?
Well, I'm really continue to be worried about this type of a situation, like what we saw in Seattle. You had an nationwide search for an appointed chief of police. We saw CHOP. The homicide rate is at historic highs right now, as well as shootings. It's because the police chief there was beholden to a bunch of downtown Seattle politicians. Now, the sheriff's office, which is really only responsible for contract cities and police in the unincorporated areas of King County, is now once again controlled in its entirety by politicians downtown Seattle. In addition to not being elected, all the criminal justice policy is set down there. And when we're seeing these dramatic increases in crime and this incredible erosion, more than 150 officers across the county going away just this year, you're going to see continued increases in crime. So it's going to be a problem. However, it is the will of the voters. So we will work as hard as we can. I'm really the only member of the King County Council with legitimate criminal justice experience as a former federal prosecutor in several jurisdictions around the country. We'll do what we can to make sure the constituents in our districts all across the borders are kept safe.
Thank you for that. And it sounds like we're kind of heading into this next piece here, Charter Amendment 6, which also passed here. This is the one that gives the county council more control over the sheriff's office with the possibility of potentially reducing the sheriff's duties and powers. Councilmember Zahilay, there's been some pushback on this as well, as you know, but you have supported this. I want to talk about what generally you think the impact is going to be on Amendment 6 on King County.
It will allow the King County Council to have policy instruction over public safety. Right now, we have budgetary sticks and carrots, and we can incentivize the sheriff's office to do things, but we can't directly tell them what to do. And what we've heard resoundingly from the public, millions of people nationally, tens of thousands of people locally, and as evidenced by the charter amendment passing, we see that there's support for this. People want to move away from a system where we send armed police officers to respond to every challenge in our region, to one that looks more like a diverse menu of public health and community-based options. So when you call 911, you can have an option of sending a mental health crisis officer, a rapid response social worker, violence interrupters, mentors, as opposed to this one-stop shop solution of deploying armed police officers. I think that's what Charter Amendment 6 is going to allow the King County Council to do.
Okay. Councilmember Dunn, your reaction to that and just the fact that 62% of the voters out there said yes to this, and now it's your job to try to implement this somehow.
Well, it failed spectacularly in my district and in the areas of unincorporated King County. So the mass population in downtown Seattle and the urban core overrun the votes locally. But again, where it's the way we're used to that out in unincorporated King County. But what you're hearing and what Girmay just alluded to is the systematic defunding and dismantling of the criminal justice system, of law enforcement officers, making sure that we are taking away and decriminalizing all kinds of crimes, diverting felons, and zero youth incarceration. What it'll mean in the next several years, we'll continue to see dramatic increases in crime, because organized crime doesn't care about talking to a social worker. Violent criminals don't care about talking to a social worker. You need law enforcement. Statistics all across the country prove that law enforcement's presence keeps crime down, and the theory of prosecution is deterrence. And so, unfortunately, I don't think it's going to go very well, but in a democracy, the majority rules, and we will do what we can to implement that plan.
Well, and Girmay, I'll bring you in here just to talk about some of these points, because I know you're very concerned about an area in your district there that's unincorporated in Skyway, and I think it's trying to figure out a different manner of accountability here. Help me out with that thought here, please.
A different manner of accountability for policing, you said, Brian?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The plan here is not to eliminate accountability, right? We're not saying if somebody commits a crime, nothing will happen to them. It's what happens to them. And the data that I've reviewed and that many legal scholars and social experts have shown is that if you take a young person, for example, and you prosecute them and send them to jail, that does not make them less likely to commit crime in the future. Our recidivism rate is high when we have our traditional systems of criminal legal response. But if you take young people, especially through these alternatives that are more therapeutic, that address the root of the crime, we will have better public safety outcomes.
Got it. And Councilmember Dunn, I'll head back to you here. I just know this is a conversation that the city of Seattle is having too in its own budget considerations. Here in Seattle, more than half the calls that come into SPD's 911 system are for non-criminal situations. So this idea of sending out armed officers doesn't always seem like the best idea. Help me out with that. Do you think that we need to see some changes in our overall public safety system? And will this charter amendment allow you to do that? What are your thoughts?
There's always room for change to our criminal justice system. And there's always room for alternatives to incarceration and different programs that can help get at the root causes. But to punish, for example, the police, or to make extreme major league criminal justice changes is a mistake, and to do it so quickly, because a few folks in the extreme wings of the academic community say we can do it this way. Worldwide, there's very little data on whether that plan works. Let's not talk about the root causes. Let's also talk about the victims of crime, the people who are being raped and victims of sexual assault and whose family members are murdered and who don't feel safe in their homes. Look at what is happening in Seattle right now. We are near record levels for homicides, near record levels for shootings. People aren't safe, and it's because of this attitude that we're going to attack the police. We're going to make draconian cuts. We're going to let the politicians take over. I can assure you, in year 2, 3, and 4, it's going to get worse.
I want to make sure I bring you back in here, Councilmember Zahilay, because this whole concept of politicizing things and this effort with Charter Amendments 5 and 6 to try to depoliticize things. I know you told the Seattle Times recently these yes votes on these amendments were kind of the first real test of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I know supporters have really said that this was an attempt to depoliticize the sheriff's office. But when you involve BLM, doesn't that kind of inject a whole new level of politics into this discussion? Your thoughts about that?
Well, Brian, I just wanted to quickly respond. I was going to say that
please.
Often I find it concerning when people use data points from our current regime. The police haven't been defunded. The sheriff's office is still exactly the way it's been. to use data points of crime being at an all-time high or near an all-time high right now under the current regime doesn't make sense to me, because we're saying we want change so that we don't have record crime on the books. And that traditional system, we're saying, is contributing to that crime. We have a global pandemic right now. People are out of work at record levels. There's a recession. People are feeling anxiety. Of course, there's going to be crime, especially when people don't have the kinds of support they need to thrive and be safe. This alternative track we're talking about is specifically to address that. And yes, I think the Black Lives Matter movement is definitely a big part of creating the political will, making our country and our county wake up to the fact that we have unjust and unsustainable systems at play here, and that we need to make a change.
Councilmember Dunn, I'll bring it back in. I know there was about a year and a half worth of work from the Charter Review Commission looking at this, and they came to this conclusion about having a sheriff who was appointed, not elected here. Some of this work has been going on locally, and I know a lot of people in the Seattle area, King County area, have been giving some feedback about sheriffs and law enforcement. We certainly saw it in the CHOP and other areas there. Just being responsive to that local feedback, because I think there's plenty of that too on this.
Yeah, I mean, Dow Constantine, Executive Constantine, stacked the Charter Review Commission to get the result he wanted, which was more control, of course, over, and to eliminate an elected sheriff and put it in place somebody that he appoints. Okay, fine. They won that fight. That's good. The system that has dramatically increased homicides is this new regime that that Girmay is talking about right now. It is this defund the police, shut down precincts, CHOP. Look what we're seeing. That is the spike that's happened this year under that regime. You can go to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Look, I was a federal prosecutor in 3 jurisdictions across the country. I wrote President Bush's national effort to fight gun violence. I will tell you that the system is far from perfect, but you must have at least an adequate baseline of law enforcement personnel in the community, or people will begin to prey on that lack of availability. And when there is zero youth incarceration, organized crime can bring in 16 and 17-year-olds to do whatever they want. When there is this diverting felons for decriminalization across the board, you're going to have people out on the street committing crimes. When Dow Constantine releases 1,200 prisoners out into our streets, we're going to have recidivism, because we know about 90% reoffend after 6 years. So we can try these new programs that Councilmember Zahilay has talked about, but I don't think we should be very careful on how we roll that out, because there's very little data that shows that work, and a whole lot of data that shows across a lot of first world nations that at least having a basic law enforcement presence does affect and impact crime.
Girmay, I'll let you wrap this up if you want to respond to what Councilmember Dunn's saying. And also, I just wanted to point out that we've got 4 cities in King County: Woodinville, Enumclaw, Covington, Maple Valley, all passing resolutions opposing these measures here. Your thoughts to wrap up this, please.
For me, I want to make sure we elevate the voices of people who've been most negatively impacted, people who are most vulnerable to police violence. And that's what these 2 charter amendments allow us to do. For Charter Amendment 5, we can have a community stakeholder process of people who have been harmed, people like George Floyd. And we have our own George Floyds in King County. My Chance Dunlap Gittens, Tommy Lay. These are people who were murdered at the hands of police who weren't posing a threat to the police's lives in that moment. So it allows us to elevate those voices, and Charter Amendment 6 also allows us to craft our public policy around the people who are most vulnerable. And so, yes, I do believe that there are people who oppose these amendments, but they will be included in the process. And again, we're all on the same page about increasing public safety. Nobody is advocating to eliminate accountability. Nobody wants to feel less safe.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to move on to another part of the conversation, because I know the King County Council has been doing a lot of different work recently. And Reagan, maybe I can head back to you. I know you've been working on some legislation regarding COVID vaccines in King County, whatever else. Can you tell us what you've been up to, please?
Well, we've been busy doing a lot of stuff, but one of the things that we need to focus on is obviously recovering from this pandemic. I don't think the Trump administration took it seriously enough. I've been very strongly advocating for social distancing measures from the beginning. The city of Renton is putting together a vaccine manufacturing facility proposal in the city so that we have a domestic vaccination supply that can be easily accessed and sourced to King County and the rest of the state as soon as possible. We want to make sure that we are the best organized in terms of vaccine distribution. The state sort of sketched out their idea of how we're going to get a vaccine to public. I moved a substantial amount of money just yesterday in the budget for outreach to historically underrepresented communities, seniors who may not have access to the internet, non-English speaking folks. We want to have a plan, and I want to thank Councilmember Zahilay for his support of that. We want to make sure that the minute those vaccines are accessible, they are out, so that anyone who wants to can go a few blocks down the street to the local pharmacy or health clinic, get vaccinated, and do it for free.
Thank you very much for that. Councilmember Zahilay, you've been dealing with a number of issues as well, and I wanted to make sure we focused on your efforts to prioritize the needs of people in Skyway specifically, because I know that's been a big emphasis for you over the past several months.
Absolutely. For those who don't know, Skyway is an urban unincorporated community just south of Seattle and north of Renton. It's urban, meaning that it's not shielded from the economic impacts of Seattle and Renton, but it also has fewer protections because it's unincorporated. As Councilmember Dunn knows, unincorporated areas don't have the representation that they need, and they pay more in property taxes. And when you think about the demographics of Skyway, it's 70% people of color, the highest proportion of Black people in Washington state, but it has a high poverty rate, a low area median income, and yet King County for a long time has disinvested in this community. So I'm super thankful for my King County Council colleagues, including Councilmember Dunn, for putting the investments into this community using this biennial budget. We just got $5 million for affordable housing, $10 million for a community center, $10 million for participatory budgeting in that neighborhood. And I think we're finally going to start turning the corner and making this the model for investing in a community without displacing the people who call it home.
Thanks very much for that. We need to wrap up the show. I can give each of you about 45 seconds here. A lot of talk about unity coming together over the last week after a very contentious presidential election finally happened there. Clearly, we're dealing with some divided politics on a national, a local level, too. Councilmember Zahilay, maybe I can ask you here, your final thoughts coming together after a bruising political season.
I think this is the perfect example of coming together, Brian. If you ask anybody, probably the two ends of the political spectrum on the King County Council are myself and Reagan Dunn. But if you ask me who I would love to get a beer with the most, it's probably Councilmember Dunn. We can have intelligent conversations like this. There isn't the silliness that you see at the federal level. There isn't just the puffing of the chest and all the things that people do at the federal level to undermine each other. We came here to have an intelligent debate, and I don't doubt one bit that Councilmember Dunn wants the best for King County, just like I do.
Councilmember Dunn, I'll let you wrap up. It sounds like the beer tab might be on you, but just some final thoughts about unity as we get through this political season.
Well, I think a democracy is an amazing thing. And we saw over the last week or two how a democracy works and changes leadership. And we have a new president. We have an historic new vice president, which is very exciting. The one thing I hear when I talk to people in the community, and polls show this too, is they want their leaders to work in a bipartisan way to find solutions that help solve our problems. We got big problems. We got to get people back to work. We have got to get this pandemic under control. It's really important. Folks can't find a way to pay rent right now. We need to help with that. So I think we have a new time, a renewal in America and locally as well. Let's work together and let's continue our job to solve the problems and help people out in this tough, challenging time.
All right. Thank you both very much for your time, and we will be right back. Here's what people are saying on social media. The lawsuits are baseless and have zero chance of making Trump president. Also, #StopTheSteal. We citizens are watching.
We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Coming up next week, it's budget time at Seattle City Hall. We'll dive into the city's priorities for 2021 and take a look at whether the City Council and Mayor are in sync when it comes to homeless funding, economic recovery, and the future of the Seattle Police Department. That's all next time on City Inside Out. I hope you join us.